once present only locally in Australia, became widespread. Shell fishhooks appeared within the last 1,000 years. Why did Australia not develop metal tools, writing, and politically complex societies? A major reason is that Aborigines remained hunter-gatherers, whereas, as we saw in chapters 12, 14, those developments arose elsewhere only in populous and economically specialized societies of food producers. In addition, Australia's aridity, infertility, and climatic unpredictability limited its hunter-gatherer. Population to only a few 100,000 people. Compared with the tens of millions of people in ancient China or Mesoamerica, that meant that Australia had far fewer potential inventors, and far fewer societies to experiment with adopting innovations. Nor were its several 100,000 people organized into closely interacting societies. Aboriginal Australia instead consisted of a sea of very sparsely populated desert, separating several more productive ecological islands, each of them holding only a fraction of the continent's population and with interactions attenuated by the intervening distance. Even within the relatively moist and productive eastern side of the continent, exchanges between societies were limited by the 1,900 miles from Queensland's tropical rainforests in the northeast to Victoria's temperate rainforests in the southeast. A geographic and ecological distance as great as that from Los Angeles to Alaska. Some apparent regional or continent-wide regressions of technology in Australia may stem from the isolation and relatively few inhabitants of its population centers. The boomerang, that quintessential Australian weapon, was abandoned in the Cape York Peninsula of northeastern Australia. When encountered by Europeans, the Aborigines of southwestern Australia did not eat shellfish. The function of the small stone points that appear in Australian archaeological sites around 5,000 years ago remains uncertain, while an easy explanation is that they may have been used as spear points and barbs. They are suspiciously similar to the stone points and barbs used on arrows elsewhere in the world. If they really were so used, the mystery of bows and arrows being present in modern New Guinea but absent in Australia might be compounded. Perhaps bows and arrows actually were adopted for a while, then abandoned, across the Australian continent. All these examples remind us of the abandonment of guns in Japan, of bows and arrows and pottery in most of Polynesia, and of other technologies in other isolated societies. The most extreme losses of technology in the Australian region took place on the island of Tasmania, 130 miles off the coast of southeastern Australia. At Pleistocene times of low sea level, the shallow Bass Strait now separating Tasmania from Australia was dry land, and the people occupying Tasmania were part of the human population distributed continuously over an expanded Australian continent. When the strait was at last flooded around 10,000 years ago, Tasmanians and mainland Australians became cut off from each other because neither group possessed watercraft capable of negotiating Bass Strait. Thereafter, Tasmania's population of 4,000 hunter-gatherers remained out of contact with all other humans on Earth, living in an isolation otherwise known only from science fiction novels. When finally encountered by Europeans in AD 1642, the Tasmanians had the simplest material culture of any people in the modern world. Like mainland Aborigines, they were hunter-gatherers without metal tools. But they also lacked many technologies and artifacts widespread on the mainland, including barbed spears, bone tools of any type, boomerangs, ground or polished stone tools, hafted stone tools, hooks, nets, pronged spears, traps, and the practices of catching and eating fish, sewing, and starting a fire. Some of these technologies may have arrived or been invented in mainland Australia only after Tasmania became isolated, in which case we can conclude that the tiny Tasmanian population did not independently invent these technologies for itself. Others of these technologies were brought to Tasmania when it was still part of the Australian mainland, and were subsequently lost in Tasmania's cultural isolation. For example, the Tasmanian archaeological record documents the disappearance of fishing, and of awls, needles, and other bone tools around 1500 BC. On at least 3 smaller islands that were isolated from Australia or Tasmania by rising sea levels around 10,000 years ago, human populations that would initially have numbered around 200 to 400 died out completely. Tasmania and those three smaller islands thus illustrate in extreme form a conclusion of broad potential significance for world history. Human populations of only a few hundred people were unable to survive indefinitely in complete isolation. A population of 4,000 was able to survive for 10,000 years, but with significant cultural losses and significant failures to invent, leaving it with a uniquely simplified material culture. Mainland Australia's 300,000 hunter-gatherers were more numerous and less isolated than the Tasmanians, but still constituted the smallest and most isolated human populations of any of the continents. The documented instances of technological regression on the Australian mainland and the example of Tasmania suggest that the limited repertoire of native Australians compared with that of peoples of other continents may stem in part from the effects of isolation and population size on the development and maintenance of technology, like those effects on Tasmania, but less extreme. By implication, the same effects may have contributed to differences in technology between the largest continent and the next smaller ones. Why didn't more advanced technology reach Australia from its neighbors, Indonesia and New Guinea? As regards Indonesia, it was separated from northwestern Australia by water and was very different from it ecologically. In addition, Indonesia itself was a cultural and technological backwater until a few thousand years ago. There is no evidence of any new technology or introduction reaching Australia from Indonesia after Australia's initial colonization 40,000 years ago until the dingo appeared around 1500 BC. The dingo reached Australia at the peak of the Austronesian expansion from South China through Indonesia. Austronesians succeeded in settling all the islands of Indonesia, including the two closest to Australia, Timor and Tanimbar. Since Austronesians covered far greater sea distances in the course of their expansion across the Pacific, we would have to assume that they repeatedly reached Australia, even if we did not have the evidence of the dingo to prove it. In historical times, northwestern Australia was visited each year by sailing canoes from the Makassar district on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi until the Australian government stopped the visits in 1907. Archaeological evidence traces the visits back until around AD 1000, and they may well have been going on earlier. The main purpose of the visits was to obtain sea cucumbers, starfish relatives exported from Makassar to China as a reputed aphrodisiac and prized ingredient of soups. Naturally, the trade that developed during the Macassans' annual visits left many legacies in northwestern Australia. The Macassans planted tamarind trees at their coastal campsites and sired children by Aboriginal women. Cloth, metal tools, pottery, and glass were brought as trade goods, though Aborigines never learned to manufacture those items themselves. Aborigines did acquire from the Macassans some loanwords, some ceremonies, and the practices of using dugout sailing canoes and smoking tobacco in pipes. But none of these influences altered the basic character of Australian society. More important than what happened as a result of the Macassan visits is what did not happen. The Macassans did not settle in Australia, undoubtedly because the area of northwestern Australia facing Indonesia is much too dry for Macassan agriculture. Had Indonesia faced the tropical rainforests and savannas of northeastern Australia, the Macassans could have settled, but there is no evidence that they ever traveled that far. Since the Macassans thus came only in small numbers and for temporary visits and never penetrated inland, just a few groups of Australians on a small stretch of coast were exposed to them. Even those few Australians got to see only a fraction of Macassan culture and technology, rather than a full Macassan society with rice fields, pigs, villages, and workshops. Because the Australians remained nomadic hunter-gatherers, they acquired only those few Macassan products and practices compatible with their lifestyle. Dugout sailing canoes and pipes. Yes, forges and pigs, no. Apparently much more astonishing than Australians' resistance to Indonesian influence is their resistance to New Guinea influence. Across the narrow ribbon of water known as Torres Strait, New Guinea farmers who spoke New Guinea languages and had pigs, pottery, and bows and arrows faced Australian hunter-gatherers who spoke Australian languages and lacked pigs, pottery, and bows and arrows. Furthermore, the strait is not an open water barrier but is dotted with a chain of islands, of which the largest lies only 10 miles from the Australian coast. There were regular trading visits between Australia and the islands, and between the islands and New Guinea. Many Aboriginal women came as wives to Muralug Island, where they saw gardens and bows and arrows. How was it that those New Guinea traits did not get transmitted to Australia? This cultural barrier at Torres Strait is astonishing only because we may mislead ourselves into picturing a full-fledged New Guinea society, with intensive agriculture and pigs 10 miles off the Australian coast. In reality, Cape York Aborigines never saw a mainland New Guinean. Instead, there was trade between New Guinea and the islands nearest New Guinea, then between those islands and Mabuyag Island halfway down the strait, then between Mabuyag Island and Badu Island farther down the strait, then between Badu Island and Muralug Island. And finally between Muralug and Cape York. New Guinea society became attenuated along that island chain. Pigs were rare or absent on the islands. Lowland South New Guineans along Torres Strait practiced not the intensive agriculture of the New Guinea highlands, but a slash-and-burn agriculture with heavy reliance on seafoods, hunting, and gathering. The importance of even those slash-and-burn practices decreased from southern New Guinea toward Australia along the island chain. Muralug Island itself, the island nearest Australia, was dry, marginal for agriculture, and supported only a small human population, which subsisted mainly on seafood, wild yams, and mangrove fruits. The interface between New Guinea and Australia across Torres Strait was thus reminiscent of the children's game of telephone, in which children sit in a circle, one child whispers a word into the ear of the second child, who whispers what she thinks she has just heard to the third child. And the word finally whispered by the last child back to the first child bears no resemblance to the initial word. Landers and Cape York Aborigines were an uninterrupted love feast at which Aborigines eagerly sopped up culture from island teachers. Trade instead alternated with war for the purposes of headhunting and capturing women to become wives. Despite the dilution of New Guinea culture by distance and war, some New Guinea influence did manage to reach Australia. Intermarriage carried New Guinea physical features, such as coiled rather than straight hair, down the Cape York Peninsula. For Cape York languages had phonemes unusual for Australia, possibly because of the influence of the New Guinea languages. The most important transmissions were of New Guinea shell fishhooks, which spread far into Australia, and of New Guinea outrigger canoes, which spread down the Cape York Peninsula. New Guinea drums, ceremonial masks, funeral posts, and pipes were also adopted on Cape York. But Cape York Aborigines did not adopt agriculture, in part because what they saw of it on Muralug Island was so watered down. They did not adopt pigs, of which there were few or none on the islands, and which they would in any case have been unable to feed without agriculture. Nor did they adopt bows and arrows, remaining instead with their spears and spear throwers. Australia is big, and so is New Guinea. But contact between those two big landmasses was restricted to those few small groups of Torres Strait Islanders with a highly attenuated New Guinea culture, interacting with those few small groups of Cape York Aborigines. The latter group's decisions, for whatever reason, to use spears rather than bows and arrows, and not to adopt certain other features of the diluted New Guinea culture they saw, blocked transmission of those New Guinea cultural traits to all the rest of Australia. As a result, no New Guinea trait except shell fishhooks spread far into Australia. If the hundreds of thousands of farmers in the cool New Guinea highlands had been in close contact with the Aborigines in the cool highlands of southeastern Australia, a massive transfer of intensive food production and New Guinea culture to Australia might have followed. But the New Guinea highlands are separated from the Australian highlands by 2,000 miles of ecologically very different landscape. The New Guinea highlands might as well have been the mountains of the moon, as far as Australians' chances of observing and adopting New Guinea highland practices were concerned. In short, the persistence of Stone Age nomadic hunter-gatherers in Australia, trading with Stone Age New Guinea farmers and Iron Age Indonesian farmers, at first seems to suggest singular obstinacy on the part of native Australians. On closer examination, it merely proves to reflect the ubiquitous role of geography in the transmission of human culture and technology. It remains for us to consider the encounters of New Guinea's and Australia's Stone Age societies with Iron Age Europeans. A Portuguese navigator discovered New Guinea in 1526, Holland claimed the western half in 1828, and Britain and Germany divided the eastern half in 1884. The first Europeans settled on the coast, and it took them a long time to penetrate into the interior, but by 1960 European governments had established political control over most New Guineans. The reasons that Europeans colonized New Guinea, rather than vice versa, are obvious. Europeans were the ones who had the ocean-going ships and compasses to travel to New Guinea, the writing systems and printing presses to produce maps, descriptive accounts, and administrative paperwork useful in establishing control over New Guinea, the political institutions to organize the ships, soldiers, and administration, and the guns to shoot New Guineans who resisted with bow and arrow and clubs. Yet the number of European settlers was always very small, and today New Guinea is still populated largely by New Guineans. That contrasts sharply with the situation in Australia, the Americas, and South Africa, where European settlement was numerous and lasting and replaced the original native population over large areas. Why was New Guinea different? A major factor was the one that defeated all European attempts to settle the New Guinea lowlands until the 1880s, malaria and other tropical diseases, none of them an acute epidemic crowd infection as discussed in Chapter 11. The most ambitious of those failed lowland settlement plans, organized by the French Marquis de Rays around 1880, on the nearby island of New Ireland, ended with 930 out of the 1,000 colonists dead within 3 years. Even with modern medical treatments available today, many of my American and European friends in New Guinea have been forced to leave because of malaria, hepatitis, or other diseases, while my own health legacy of New Guinea has been a year of malaria and a year of dysentery. As Europeans were being felled by New Guinea lowland germs, why were Eurasian germs not simultaneously felling New Guineans? Some New Guineans did become infected, but not on the massive scale that killed off most of the native peoples of Australia and the Americas. One lucky break for New Guineans was that there were no permanent European settlements in New Guinea until the 1880s, by which time public health discoveries had made progress in bringing smallpox and other infectious diseases of European populations under control. In addition, the Austronesian expansion had already been bringing a stream of Indonesian settlers and traders to New Guinea for 3,500 years. Since Asian mainland infectious diseases were well established in Indonesia, New Guineans thereby gained long exposure and built up much more resistance to Eurasian germs than did Aboriginal Australians. The sole part of New Guinea where Europeans do not suffer from severe health problems is the highlands, above the altitudinal ceiling for malaria. But the highlands, already occupied by dense populations of New Guineans, were not reached by Europeans until the 1930s. By then, the Australian and Dutch colonial governments were no longer willing to open up lands for white settlement, by killing native people in large numbers or driving them off their lands, as had happened during earlier centuries of European colonialism. The remaining obstacle to European would-be settlers was that European crops, livestock, and subsistence methods do poorly everywhere in the New Guinea environment and climate. While introduced tropical American crops such as squash, corn, and tomatoes are now grown in small quantities, and tea and coffee plantations have been established in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, staple European crops, like wheat, barley, and peas, have never taken hold. Introduced cattle and goats, kept in small numbers, suffer from tropical diseases, just as do European people themselves. Food production in New Guinea is still dominated by the crops and agricultural methods that New Guineans perfected over the course of thousands of years. All those problems of disease, rugged terrain, and subsistence contributed to Europeans leaving eastern New Guinea occupied and governed by New Guineans, who nevertheless use English as their official language, write with the alphabet, live under democratic governmental institutions modeled on those of England, and use guns manufactured overseas. The outcome was different in western New Guinea, which Indonesia took over from Holland in 1963 and renamed Irian Jaya Province. The province is now governed by Indonesians, for Indonesians. Its rural population is still overwhelmingly New Guinean, but its urban population is Indonesian, as a result of government policy aimed at encouraging Indonesian immigration. Indonesians, with their long history of exposure to malaria and other tropical diseases shared with New Guineans, have not faced as potent a germ barrier as have Europeans. They are also better prepared than Europeans for subsisting in New Guinea, because Indonesian agriculture already included bananas, sweet potatoes, and some other staple crops of New Guinea agriculture. The ongoing changes in Irian Jaya represent the continuation, backed by a centralized government's full resources, of the Austronesian expansion that began to reach New Guinea 3,500 years ago. Indonesians are modern Austronesians. Europeans colonized Australia, rather than native Australians colonizing Europe, for the same reasons that we have just seen in the case of New Guinea. However, the fates of New Guineans and of Aboriginal Australians were very different. Today, Australia is populated and governed by 20 million non-Aborigines, most of them of European descent, plus increasing numbers of Asians arriving since Australia abandoned its previous white Australia immigration policy in 1973. The Aboriginal population declined by 80%, from around 300,000 at the time of European settlement to a minimum of 60,000 in 1921. Aborigines today form an underclass of Australian society. Many of them live on mission stations or government reserves, or else work for whites as herdsmen on cattle stations. Why did Aborigines fare so much worse than New Guineans? The basic reason is Australia's suitability for European food production and settlement, combined with the role of European guns, germs, and steel in clearing Aborigines out of the way. While I already stressed the difficulties posed by Australia's climate and soils, its most productive or fertile areas can nevertheless support European farming. Agriculture in the Australian temperate zone is now dominated by the Eurasian temperate zone staple crops of wheat, barley, oats, apples, and grapes, along with sorghum and cotton of African Sahel origins and potatoes of Andean origins. In tropical areas of northeastern Australia beyond the optimal range of fertile crescent crops, European farmers introduced sugarcane of New Guinea origins, bananas and citrus fruit of tropical Southeast Asian origins, and peanuts of tropical South American origins. As for livestock, Eurasian sheep made it possible to extend food production to arid areas of Australia unsuitable for agriculture, and Eurasian cattle joined crops in moister areas. Thus, the development of food production in Australia had to await the arrival of non-native crops and animals, domesticated in climatically similar parts of the world too remote for their domesticates to reach Australia, until brought by transoceanic shipping. Unlike New Guinea, most of Australia lacked diseases serious enough to keep out Europeans. Only in tropical northern Australia did malaria and other tropical diseases force Europeans to abandon their 19th century attempts at settlement, which succeeded only with the development of 20th century medicine. Australian Aborigines, of course, stood in the way of European food production, especially because what was potentially the most productive farmland and dairy country initially supported Australia's densest populations of Aboriginal hunter-gatherers. European settlement reduced the number of Aborigines by two means. One involved shooting them, an option that Europeans considered more acceptable in the 19th and late 18th centuries than when they entered the New Guinea highlands in the 1930s. The last large-scale massacre, of 31 Aborigines, occurred at Alice Springs in 1928. The other means involved European-introduced germs to which Aborigines had had no opportunity to acquire immunity, or to evolve genetic resistance. Within a year of the first European settlers' arrival at Sydney, in 1788, corpses of Aborigines who had died in epidemics became a common sight. The principal recorded killers were smallpox, influenza, measles, typhoid, typhus, chickenpox, whooping cough, tuberculosis, and syphilis. In these two ways, independent Aboriginal societies were eliminated in all areas suitable for European food production. The only societies that survived more or less intact were those in areas of northern and western Australia useless to Europeans. Within 1 century of European colonization, 40,000 years of Aboriginal traditions had been mostly swept away. We can now return to the problem that I posed near the beginning of this chapter. How, except by postulating deficiencies in the Aborigines themselves, can one account for the fact that white English colonists apparently created a literate, food-producing, industrial democracy within a few decades of colonizing a continent whose inhabitants after more than 40 000 years were still non-literate nomadic hunter-gatherers? Doesn't that constitute a perfectly controlled experiment in the evolution of human societies? Forcing us to a simple racist conclusion, the resolution of this problem is simple. White English colonists did not create a literate, food-producing, industrial democracy in Australia. Instead, they imported all of the elements from outside Australia, the livestock, all of the crops, the metallurgical knowledge, the steam engines, the guns, the alphabet, the political institutions, even the germs. All these were the end products of 10,000 years of development in Eurasian environments. By an accident of geography, the colonists who landed at Sydney in 1788 inherited those elements. Europeans have never learned to survive in Australia or New Guinea without their inherited Eurasian technology. Robert Burke and William Willis were smart enough to write, but not smart enough to survive in Australian desert regions where Aborigines were living. The people who did create a society in Australia were Aboriginal Australians. Of course, the society that they created was not a literate, food-producing, industrial democracy. The reasons follow straightforwardly from features of the Australian environment. Chapter 16. How China Became Chinese. Immigration, affirmative action, multilingualism, ethnic diversity. My state of California was among the pioneers of these controversial policies and is now pioneering a backlash against them. A glance into the classrooms of the Los Angeles public school system, where my sons are being educated, fleshes out the abstract debates with the faces of children. Those children represent over 80 languages spoken in the home, with English-speaking whites in the minority. Every single one of my son's playmates has at least one parent or grandparent who was born outside the United States. That's true of 3 of my own son's 4 grandparents. But immigration is merely restoring the diversity that America held for thousands of years. Before European settlement, the mainland United States was home to hundreds of Native American tribes and languages and came under control of a single government, only within the last 100 years. In these respects, the United States is a thoroughly normal country. All but one of the world's 6 most populous nations are melting pots that achieved political unification recently, and that still support hundreds of languages and ethnic groups. For example, Russia, once a small Slavic state centered on Moscow, did not even begin its expansion beyond the Ural Mountains until AD 1582. From then until the 19th century, Russia proceeded to swallow up dozens of non-Slavic peoples, many of which retain their original language and cultural identity. Just as American history is the story of how our continent's expanse became American, Russia's history is the story of how Russia became Russian. India, Indonesia, and Brazil are also recent political creations, home to about 850, 670, and 210 languages, respectively. The great exception to this rule of the recent melting pot is the world's most populous nation, China. Today, China appears politically, culturally, and linguistically monolithic, at least to lay people. It was already unified politically in 221. How China became Chinese. BC and has remained so for most of the centuries since then. From the beginnings of literacy in China, it has had only a single writing system 22, whereas modern Europe uses dozens of modified alphabets 23. Of China's 1.2 billion people, over 800 million speak Mandarin, the language with by far the largest number of native speakers in the world. Some 300 million others speak 7 other languages as similar to Mandarin, and to each other, as Spanish is to Italian. Thus, not only is China not a melting pot, but it seems absurd to ask how China became Chinese. China has been Chinese, almost from the beginnings of its recorded history. We take this seeming unity of China so much for granted that we forget how astonishing it is. One reason why we should not have expected such unity is genetic. While a coarse racial classification of world peoples lumps all Chinese people as so-called Mongoloids, that category conceals much more variation than the differences between Swedes, Italians, and Irish within Europe. In particular, North and South Chinese are genetically and physically rather different. North Chinese are most similar to Tibetans and Nepalese, while South Chinese are similar to Vietnamese and Filipinos. My North and South Chinese friends can often distinguish each other at a glance by physical appearance. The North Chinese tend to be taller, heavier, paler, with more pointed noses, and with smaller eyes that appear more slanted. North and South China differ in environment and climate as well. The north is drier and colder, the south, wetter and hotter. Genetic differences arising in those differing environments imply a long history of moderate isolation between peoples of North and South China. How did those peoples nevertheless end up with the same or very similar languages and cultures? China's apparent linguistic near-unity is also puzzling in view of the linguistic disunity of other long-settled parts of the world. For instance, we saw in the last chapter that New Guinea, with less than 1/10 of China's area and with only about 40,000 years of human history, has 1,000 languages, including dozens of language groups whose differences are far greater than those among the 8 main Chinese languages. Western Europe has evolved or acquired about 40 languages just in the 6,000, 8,000 years since the arrival of Indo-European languages, including languages as different as English, Finnish 24, and Russian. Yet fossils attest to human presence in China for over 500,000 years. What happened to the tens of thousands of distinct languages that must have arisen in China over that long time span? Cation involved the drastic homogenization of a huge region in an ancient melting pot, the repopulation of tropical Southeast Asia, and the exertion of a massive influence on Japan, Korea, and possibly even India. Hence the history of China offers the key to the history of all of East Asia. This chapter will tell the story of how China did become Chinese. A convenient starting point is a detailed linguistic map of China. A glance at it is an eye-opener to all of us accustomed to thinking of China as monolithic. It turns out that, in addition to China's 8 big languages, Mandarin and its 7 close relatives, with between 11 million and 800 million speakers each, China also has over 130 little languages, many of them with just a few thousand speakers. All these languages, big and a little, fall into 4 language families, which differ greatly in the compactness of their distributions. At one extreme, Mandarin and its relatives, which constitute the Chinese subfamily of the Sino-Tibetan language family, are distributed continuously from North to South China. One could walk through China, from Manchuria in the north to the Gulf of Tonkin in the south, while remaining entirely within land occupied by native speakers of Mandarin and its relatives. The other 3 families have fragmented distributions, being spoken by islands of people surrounded by a sea of speakers of Chinese and other language families. Especially fragmented is the distribution of the Yao family, which consists of 6 million speakers divided among about 5 languages, bearing the colorful names of red Miao, white Miao, black Miao, green Miao, and Yao. Yao speakers live in dozens of small enclaves, all surrounded by speakers of other language families and scattered over an area of 500,000 square miles, extending from South China to Thailand. More than 100,000 Miao-speaking refugees from Vietnam have carried this language family to the United States, where they are better known under the alternative name of Hmong. Another fragmented language group is the Austroasiatic family, whose most widely spoken languages are Vietnamese and Cambodian 25. The 60 million Austroasiatic speakers are scattered from Vietnam in the east to the Malay Peninsula in the south, and to northern India in the west. The 4th and last of China's language families is the Kadai family, whose 50 million speakers are distributed from South China southward into peninsular Thailand west to Myanmar. How China became Chinese. Naturally, Yao speakers did not acquire their current fragmented distribution as a result of ancient helicopter flights that dropped them here, and there over the Asian landscape. Instead, one might guess that they once had a more nearly continuous distribution, which became fragmented as speakers of other language families expanded or induced Yao speakers to abandon their tongues. In fact, much of that process of linguistic fragmentation occurred within the past 2,500 years and is well documented historically. The ancestors of modern speakers of Thai, Lao, and Burmese all moved south from South China and adjacent areas to their present locations within historical times, successively inundating the settled descendants of previous migrations. Speakers of Chinese languages were especially vigorous in replacing and linguistically converting other ethnic groups, whom Chinese speakers looked down upon as primitive and inferior. The recorded history of China's Zhou dynasty, from 1100 to 221 BC, describes the conquest and absorption of most of China's non-Chinese-speaking population by Chinese-speaking states. Naturally, Miao, Yao speakers did not acquire their current fragmented distribution as a result of ancient helicopter flights that dropped them here and there over the Asian landscape. Instead, one might guess that they once had a more nearly continuous distribution, which became fragmented as speakers of other language families expanded or induced Miao, Yao speakers to abandon their tongues. In fact, much of that process of linguistic fragmentation occurred within the past 2,500 years and is well documented historically. The ancestors of modern speakers of Thai, Lao, and Burmese all moved south from South China and adjacent areas to their present locations within historical times, successively inundating the settled descendants of previous migrations. Speakers of Chinese languages were especially vigorous in replacing and linguistically converting other ethnic groups, whom Chinese speakers looked down upon as primitive and inferior. The recorded history of China's Zhou dynasty, from 1100 to 221 BC, describes the conquest and absorption of most of China's non-Chinese-speaking population by Chinese-speaking states. We can use several types of reasoning to try to reconstruct the linguistic map of East Asia as of several thousand years ago. First, we can reverse the historically known linguistic expansions of recent millennia. Second, we can reason that modern areas with just a single language or related language group occupying a large, continuous area testify to a recent geographic expansion of that group, such that not enough historical time has elapsed for it to differentiate into many languages. How China became Chinese. Figure 16.1, the four language families of China and Southeast Asia. 280. How China became Chinese. Figure 16.2, modern political borders in East and Southeast Asia, for use in interpreting the distributions of language families shown in Figure 16.1. Gauges within a given language family lie closer to the early center of distribution of that language family. Using those three types of reasoning to turn back the linguistic clock, we conclude that North China was originally occupied by speakers of Chinese and other Sino-Tibetan languages, that different parts of South China were variously occupied by speakers of Miao, Yao, Austroasiatic, and Thai, Kadai languages, and that Sino-Tibetan speakers have replaced most speakers of those other families over South China. An even more drastic linguistic upheaval must have swept over tropical Southeast Asia to the south of China, in Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and peninsular Malaysia. Whatever languages were originally spoken there must now be entirely extinct, because all of the modern languages of those countries appear to be recent invaders, mainly from South China or, in a few cases, from Indonesia. Since Miao, Yao languages barely survived into the present, we might also guess that South China once harbored still other language families besides Miao, Yao, Austroasiatic, and Thai, Kadai, but that those other families left no modern surviving languages. As we shall see, the Austronesian language family may have been one of those other families that vanished from the Chinese mainland, and that we know only because it spread to Pacific Islands and survived there. These language replacements in East Asia remind us of the spread of European languages, especially English and Spanish, into the New World, formerly home to 1,000 or more Native American languages. We know from our recent history that English did not come to replace U.S. Indian languages, merely because English sounded musical to Indians' ears. Instead, the replacement entailed English-speaking immigrants killing most Indians by war, murder, and introduced diseases, and the surviving Indians being pressured into adopting English, the new majority language. The immediate causes of that language replacement were the advantages in technology and political organization, stemming ultimately from the advantage of an early rise of food production that invading Europeans held over Native Americans. Essentially, the same processes accounted for the replacement of Aboriginal Australian languages by English, and of sub-equatorial Africa's original Pygmy and Khoisan languages by Bantu languages. Hence, East Asia's linguistic upheavals raise a corresponding question. What enabled Sino-Tibetan speakers to spread from North China to South China, and speakers of Austroasiatic and the other original South China language families to spread south into tropical Southeast Asia? Here, We must turn to archaeology for evidence of the technological, political, and agricultural advantages that some. How China became Chinese. Asians evidently gained over other Asians. As everywhere else in the world, the archaeological record in East Asia for most of human history reveals only the debris of hunter-gatherers, using unpolished stone tools and lacking pottery. The first East Asian evidence for something different comes from China, where crop remains, bones of domestic animals, pottery, and polished stone tools appear by around 7500 BC. That date is within 1,000 years of the beginning of the Neolithic Age and food production in the Fertile Crescent. But because the previous millennium in China is poorly known archaeologically, one cannot decide at present whether the origins of Chinese food production were contemporaneous with those in the Fertile Crescent, slightly earlier, or slightly later. At the least, we can say that China was one of the world's first centers of plant and animal domestication. China may actually have encompassed two or more independent centers of origins of food production. I already mentioned the ecological differences between China's cool, dry north and warm, wet south. At a given latitude, there are also ecological distinctions between the coastal lowlands and the interior uplands. Different wild plants are native to these disparate environments and would thus have been variously available to incipient farmers in various parts of China. In fact, the earliest identified crops were two drought-resistant species of millet in North China, but rice in South China, suggesting the possibility of separate northern and southern centers of plant domestication. Chinese sites with the earliest evidence of crops also contained bones of domestic pigs, dogs, and chickens. These domestic animals and crops were gradually joined by China's many other domesticates. Among the animals, water buffalo were most important, while silkworms, ducks, and geese were others. Familiar later Chinese crops include soybeans, hemp, citrus fruit, tea, apricots, peaches, and pears. In addition, just as Eurasia's east-west axis permitted many of these Chinese animals and crops to spread westward in ancient times, West Asian domesticates also spread eastward to China and became important there. Especially significant Western contributions to ancient China's economy have been wheat and barley, cows and horses, and sheep and goats. As elsewhere in the world, in China food production gradually led to the other hallmarks of a civilization, discussed in chapters 11, 14. A superb Chinese tradition of bronze metallurgy had its origins in the 3rd millennium BC and eventually resulted in China's developing by far the earliest cast iron production in the world. Around 500 BC, the following 1,500 years saw the outpouring of Chinese technological inventions, mentioned in Chapter 13, that included paper, the compass, the wheelbarrow, and gunpowder. Fortified towns emerged in the 3rd millennium BC, with cemeteries whose great variation between unadorned and luxuriously furnished graves bespeaks emerging class differences. Stratified societies whose rulers could mobilize large labor forces of commoners are also attested by huge urban defensive walls, big palaces, and eventually the Grand Canal linking North and South China. Writing is preserved from the 2nd millennium BC but probably arose earlier. Our archaeological knowledge of China's emerging cities and states then becomes supplemented by written accounts of China's first dynasties, going back to the Xia dynasty, which arose around 2000 BC. As for food production's more sinister byproduct of infectious diseases, we cannot specify where within the Old World most major diseases of Old World origin arose. However, European writings from Roman and medieval times clearly describe the arrival of bubonic plague and possibly smallpox from the east, so these germs could be of Chinese or East Asian origin. Influenza is even more likely to have arisen in China, since pigs were domesticated so early and became so important there. China's size and ecological diversity spawned many separate local cultures, distinguishable archaeologically by their differing styles of pottery and artifacts. In the 4th millennium BC, those local cultures expanded geographically and began to interact, compete with each other, and coalesce. Just as exchanges of domesticates between ecologically diverse regions enriched Chinese food production, exchanges between culturally diverse regions enriched Chinese culture and technology. And fierce competition between warring chiefdoms drove the formation of ever larger and more centralized states. While China's north-south gradient retarded crop diffusion, the gradient was less of a barrier there than in the Americas or Africa, because China's north-south distances were smaller, and because China is transected neither by desert, as is Africa and northern Mexico, nor by a narrow isthmus as is Central America. Instead, China's long east-west rivers facilitated diffusion of crops and technology between the coast and inland, while its broad east-west expanse and relatively gentle terrain, which eventually permitted those two river systems to be joined by canals, facilitated north-south exchanges. All these geographic factors contributed to the early cultural and political unification of China, whereas Western Europe, with a similar how China became Chinese area but a more rugged terrain and no such unifying rivers, has resisted cultural and political unification to this day. Some developments spread from south to north in China, especially iron smelting and rice cultivation. But the predominant direction of spread was from north to south. That trend is clearest for writing, in contrast to Western Eurasia, which produced a plethora of early writing systems, such as Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Hittite, Minoan, and the Semitic alphabet. China developed just a single well-attested writing system. It was perfected in North China, spread and preempted or replaced any other nascent system, and evolved into the writing still used in China today. Other major features of North Chinese societies that spread southward were bronze technology, Sino-Tibetan languages, and state formation. All three of China's first three dynasties, the Xia and Shang and Zhou dynasties, arose in North China in the 2nd millennium BC. Preserved writings of the 1st millennium BC show that ethnic Chinese already tended then to feel culturally superior to non-Chinese barbarians, while North Chinese tended to regard even South Chinese as barbarians. For example, a late Zhou dynasty writer of the 5th millennium BC described China's other peoples as follows. The people of those 5 regions, the Middle States and the Rhone, and other wild tribes around them, had all their several natures, which they could not be made to alter. The tribes on the east were called They had their hair unbound, and tattooed their bodies. Some of them ate their food without its being cooked by fire. The Zhou author went on to describe wild tribes to the south, west, and north as indulging in equally barbaric practices, such as turning their feet inward, tattooing their foreheads, wearing skins, living in caves, not eating cereals, and, of course, eating their food raw. States organized by or modeled on that Zhou dynasty of North China spread to South China during the 1st millennium BC, culminating in China's political unification under the Qin dynasty in 221 BC. Its cultural unification accelerated during that same period as literate, civilized Chinese states absorbed, or were copied by, the illiterate barbarians. Some of that cultural unification was ferocious. For instance, the first Qin emperor condemned all previously written historical books as worthless and ordered them burned, much to the detriment of our understanding of early Chinese history and writing. Those and other draconian measures must have contributed to the spread of North China's Sino-Tibetan languages over most of China, and to reducing the Miao, Yao and other language families to their present fragmented distributions. Within East Asia, China's head start in food production, technology, writ 285. And state formation had the consequence that Chinese innovations also contributed heavily to developments in neighboring regions. For instance, until the 4th millennium BC most of tropical Southeast Asia was still occupied by hunter-gatherers making pebble and flake stone tools belonging to what is termed the Hoa Binian tradition, named after the site of Hoa Binh, in Vietnam. Thereafter, Chinese-derived crops, Neolithic technology, village living, and pottery similar to that of South China spread into tropical Southeast Asia, probably accompanied by South China's language families. The historical southward expansions of Burmese, Laotians, and Thais from South China completed the Sinification of tropical Southeast Asia. All those modern peoples are recent offshoots of their South Chinese cousins. So overwhelming was this Chinese steamroller that the former peoples of tropical Southeast Asia have left behind few traces in the region's modern populations. Just 3 relict groups of hunter-gatherers, the Semang Negritos of the Malay Peninsula, the Andaman Islanders, and the Vedoid Negritos of Sri Lanka, remain to suggest that tropical Southeast Asia's former inhabitants may have been dark-skinned and curly-haired. Like modern New Guineans and unlike the light-skinned, straight-haired South Chinese and the modern tropical Southeast Asians who are their offshoots. Those relict Negritos of Southeast Asia may be the last survivors of the source population from which New Guinea was colonized. The Semang Negritos persisted as hunter-gatherers trading with neighboring farmers but adopted an Austroasiatic language. From those farmers, much as, we shall see, Philippine Negrito and African pygmy hunter-gatherers adopted languages from their farmer trading partners. Only on the remote Andaman Islands do languages unrelated to the South Chinese language families persist, the last linguistic survivors of what must have been hundreds of now extinct Aboriginal Southeast Asian languages. Even Korea and Japan were heavily influenced by China, although their geographic isolation from it ensured that they did not lose their languages or physical and genetic distinctness, as did tropical Southeast Asia. Korea and Japan adopted rice from China in the 2nd millennium BC, bronze metallurgy by the 1st millennium BC, and writing in the 1st millennium AD. China also transmitted West Asian wheat and barley to Korea and Japan. In thus describing China's seminal role in East Asian civilization, we should not exaggerate. It is not the case that all cultural advances in East Asia stemmed from China and that Koreans, Japanese, and tropical Southeast Asians were non-inventive barbarians who contributed nothing. The ancient Japanese developed. How China became Chinese. Some of the oldest pottery in the world and settled as hunter-gatherers in villages subsisting on Japan's rich seafood resources, long before the arrival of food production. Some crops were probably domesticated first or independently in Japan, Korea, and tropical Southeast Asia. But China's role was nonetheless disproportionate. For example, the prestige value of Chinese culture is still so great in Japan and Korea that Japan has no thought of discarding its Chinese-derived writing system despite its drawbacks for representing Japanese speech. While Korea is only now replacing its clumsy Chinese-derived writing with its wonderful indigenous Hangul alphabet. That persistence of Chinese writing in Japan and Korea is a vivid 20th century legacy of plant and animal domestication in China nearly 10,000 years ago. Thanks to the achievements of East Asia's first farmers, China became Chinese, and peoples from Thailand to Easter Island became their cousins. Chapter 17. Speedboat to Polynesia. Pacific Island history is encapsulated for me in an incident that happened when 3 Indonesian friends and I walked into a store in Jayapura, the capital of Indonesian New Guinea. My friends' names were Ahmad, Waiwer, and Sawakari, and the store was run by a merchant named Pinghwa. Ahmad, an Indonesian government officer, was acting as the boss, because he and I were organizing an ecological survey for the government and had hired Waiwer and Sawakari as local assistants. But Ahmad had never before been in a New Guinea mountain forest and had no idea what supplies to buy. The results were comical. At the moment that my friends entered the store, Pinghwa was reading a Chinese newspaper. When he saw Waiwer and Sawakari, he kept reading it but then shoved it out of sight under the counter as soon as he noticed Ahmad. Ahmad picked up an axe head, causing Waiwer and Sawakari to laugh, because he was holding it upside down. Waiwer and Sawakari showed him how to hold it correctly and to test it. Ahmad and Sawakari then looked at Waiwer's bare feet, with toes splayed wide from a lifetime of not wearing shoes. Sawakari picked out the widest available shoes and held them against Waiwer's feet, but the shoes were still too narrow, sending Ahmad and Sawakari and Pinghwa into peals of laughter. Ahmad picked up a plastic comb with which to comb out his straight, coarse black hair. Glancing at Waiwer's tough, tightly coiled hair, he handed the comb to Waiwer. It immediately stuck in Waiwer's hair, then broke as soon as Waiwer pulled on the comb. Everyone laughed, including Waiwer. Waiwer responded by reminding Ahmad that he should buy lots of rice, because there would be no food to buy in New Guinea mountain villages except sweet potatoes, which would upset Ahmad's stomach. More hilarity. Despite all the laughter, I could sense the underlying tensions. Ahmad was Javan, Pinghwa Chinese, Waiwer a New Guinea Highlander, and Sawakari a new. Speedboat to Polynesia. Guinea lowlander from the north coast. Javans dominate the Indonesian government, which annexed western New Guinea in the 1960s and used bombs and machine guns to crush New Guinean opposition. Ahmad later decided to stay in town and to let me do the forest survey alone with Waiwer and Sawakari. He explained his decision to me by pointing to his straight, coarse hair, so unlike that of New Guineans, and saying that New Guineans would kill anyone with hair like his if they found him far from army backup. Pinghua had put away his newspaper because importation of Chinese writing is nominally illegal in Indonesian New Guinea. In much of Indonesia, the merchants are Chinese immigrants. Latent mutual fear between the economically dominant Chinese and politically dominant Javans erupted in 1966, in a bloody revolution, when Javans slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Chinese. As New Guineans, Waiwer and Sawakari shared most New Guineans' resentment of Javan dictatorship, but they also scorned each other's groups. Highlanders dismiss lowlanders as effete sago eaters, while lowlanders dismiss Highlanders as primitive big heads, referring both to their massive coiled hair and to their reputation for arrogance. Within a few days of my setting up an isolated forest camp with Waiwer and Sawakari, they came close to fighting each other with axes. Tensions among the groups that Ahmad, Waiwer, Sawakari, and Pinghua represent dominate the politics of Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous nation. These modern tensions have roots going back thousands of years. When we think of major overseas population movements, we tend to focus on those since Columbus's discovery of the Americas, and on the resulting replacements of non-Europeans by Europeans within historic times. But there were also big overseas movements long before Columbus, and prehistoric replacements of non-European peoples by other non-European peoples. Waiwer, Ahmad, and Sawakari represent three prehistorical waves of people that moved overseas from the Asian mainland into the Pacific. Waiwer's Highlanders are probably descended from an early wave that had colonized New Guinea from Asia by 40,000 years ago. Ahmad's ancestors arrived in Java ultimately from the South China coast, around 4,000 years ago, completing the replacement there of people related to Waiwer's ancestors. Sawakari's ancestors reached New Guinea around 3,600 years ago, as part of that same wave from the South China coast, while Pinghua's ancestors still occupy China. The population movement that brought Ahmad's and Sawakari's ancestors to Java and New Guinea, respectively, termed the Austronesian expansion, was among the biggest population movements of the last 6,000 years. One prong of it became the Polynesians, who populated the most remote islands of the Pacific and were the greatest seafarers among Neolithic peoples. Austronesian languages are spoken today as native languages over more than half of the globe's span, from Madagascar to Easter Island. In this book on human population movements since the end of the Ice Ages, the Austronesian expansion occupies a central place, as one of the most important phenomena to be explained. Why did Austronesian people, stemming ultimately from mainland China, colonize Java and the rest of Indonesia and replace the original inhabitants there, instead of Indonesians colonizing China and replacing the Chinese? Having occupied all of Indonesia, why were the Austronesians then unable to occupy more than a narrow coastal strip of the New Guinea lowlands, and why were they completely unable to displace Waiwer's people from the New Guinea highlands? How did the descendants of Chinese emigrants become transformed into Polynesians? Today, the population of Java, most other Indonesian islands, and the Philippines is rather homogeneous. In appearance and genes, those islands' inhabitants are similar to South Chinese, and even more similar to tropical Southeast Asians, especially those of the Malay Peninsula. Their languages are equally homogeneous. While 374 languages are spoken in the Philippines and Western and Central Indonesia, all of them are closely related and fall within the same subfamily of the Austronesian language family. Austronesian languages reached the Asian mainland on the Malay Peninsula and in small pockets in Vietnam and Cambodia, near the westernmost Indonesian islands of Sumatra and Borneo, but they occur nowhere else on the mainland. Some Austronesian words borrowed into English include taboo and tattoo, boondocks, and amok, batik, and orangutan. That genetic and linguistic uniformity of Indonesia and the Philippines is initially as surprising, as is the predominant linguistic uniformity of China. The famous Java Homo erectus fossils prove that humans have occupied at least western Indonesia for 1 million years. That should have given ample time for humans to evolve genetic and linguistic diversity and tropical adaptations, such as dark skins like those of many other tropical peoples, but instead Indonesians and Filipinos have light skins. It is also surprising that Indonesians and Filipinos are so similar to tropical Southeast Asians and South Chinese, in other physical features besides light skins and in their genes. Speedboat to Polynesia. Figure 17.1. The Austronesian language family consists of 4 subfamilies, 3 of them confined to Taiwan and 1 widespread. The latter subfamily in turn consists of 2 subfamilies, Western Malayo-Polynesian and Central Eastern Malayo-Polynesian. The latter subfamily in turn consists of 4 subfamilies, the very widespread Oceanic one to the east and 3 others to the west in a much smaller area comprising Halmahera, nearby islands of eastern Indonesia, and the west end of New Guinea. Australia 40,000 years ago, so one might naively have expected modern Indonesians to be like modern New Guineans and Australians. In reality, there are only a few New Guinean-like populations in the Philippine Western Indonesia area, notably the Negritos living in mountainous areas of the Philippines. As is also true of the 3 New Guinean-like relict populations that I mentioned in speaking of tropical Southeast Asia, the Philippine Negritos could be relicts of populations ancestral to Waiwers people before they reached New Guinea. Even those Negritos speak Austronesian languages similar to those of their Filipino neighbors, implying that they too have lost their original language. All these facts suggest strongly that either tropical Southeast Asians or South 291. Chinese-speaking Austronesian languages recently spread through the Philippines and Indonesia, replacing all the former inhabitants of those islands except the Philippine Negritos, and replacing all the original island languages. That event evidently took place too recently for the colonists to evolve dark skins, distinct language families, or genetic distinctiveness or diversity. Their languages are of course much more numerous than the 8 dominant Chinese languages of mainland China, but are no more diverse. The proliferation of many similar languages in the Philippines and Indonesia merely reflects the fact that the islands never underwent a political and cultural unification, as did China. Details of language distribution provide valuable clues to the root of this hypothesized Austronesian expansion. The whole Austronesian language family consists of 959 languages, divided among 4 subfamilies. But one of those subfamilies, termed Malayo-Polynesian, comprises 945 of those 959 languages, and covers almost the entire geographic range of the Austronesian family. Before the recent overseas expansion of European-speaking Indo-European languages, Austronesian was the most widespread language family in the world. That suggests that the Malayo-Polynesian subfamily differentiated recently out of the Austronesian family, and spread far from the Austronesian homeland, giving rise to many local languages. All of which are still closely related because there has been too little time to develop large linguistic differences. For the location of that Austronesian homeland, we should therefore look not to Malayo-Polynesian but to the other 3 Austronesian subfamilies, which differ considerably more from each other and from Malayo-Polynesian than the subfamilies of Malayo-Polynesian differ among each other. It turns out that those 3 other subfamilies have coincident distributions, all of them tiny compared with the distribution of Malayo-Polynesian. They are confined to aborigines of the island of Taiwan, lying only 90 miles from the South China mainland. Taiwan's aborigines had the island largely to themselves until mainland Chinese began settling in large numbers, within the last 1,000 years. Still more mainlanders arrived after 1945, especially after the Chinese Communists defeated the Chinese nationalists in 1949, so that aborigines now constitute only 2% of Taiwan's population. The concentration of 3 out of the 4 Austronesian subfamilies on Taiwan suggests that, within the present Austronesian realm, Taiwan is the homeland where Austronesian languages have been spoken for the most millennia, and have consequently had the longest time in which to diverge. All other Austronesian languages, from those on Madagascar to those on Easter Island, would then stem from a population expansion out of Taiwan. Speedboat to Polynesia. We can now turn to archaeological evidence. While the debris of ancient village sites does not include fossilized words along with bones and pottery, it does reveal movements of people and cultural artifacts that could be associated with languages. Like the rest of the world, most of the present Austronesian realm, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and many Pacific islands, was originally occupied by hunter-gatherers lacking pottery, polished stone tools, domestic animals, and crops. The first archaeological signs of something different within the Austronesian realm come from Taiwan. Beginning around the 4th millennium BC, polished stone tools and a distinctive decorated pottery style derived from earlier South China mainland pottery appeared on Taiwan, and on the opposite coast of the South China mainland. Remains of rice and millet at later Taiwanese sites provide evidence of agriculture. Tapiancaing sites of Taiwan and the South China coast are full of fish bones and mollusk shells, as well as of stone net sinkers and adzes suitable for hollowing out a wooden canoe. Evidently, those first Neolithic occupants of Taiwan had watercraft adequate for deep-sea fishing, and for regular sea traffic across Taiwan Strait, separating that island from the China coast. Thus, Taiwan Strait may have served as the training ground where mainland Chinese developed the open-water maritime skills that would permit them to expand over the Pacific. One specific type of artifact linking Taiwan's Tapiancaing culture to later Pacific Island cultures is a bark beater, a stone implement used for pounding the fibrous bark of certain tree species into rope, nets, and clothing. Once Pacific peoples spread beyond the range of wool-yielding domestic animals and fiber plant crops and hence of woven clothing, they became dependent on pounded bark cloth for their clothing. Inhabitants of Rennell Island, a traditional Polynesian island that did not become westernized until the 1930s, told me that westernization yielded the wonderful side benefit that the island became quiet. No more sounds of bark beaters everywhere, pounding out bark cloth from dawn until after dusk every day. Within a millennium or so after the Tapiancaing culture reached Taiwan, archaeological evidence shows that cultures obviously derived from it spread farther and farther from Taiwan, to fill up the modern Austronesian realm. The evidence includes ground stone tools, pottery, bones of domestic pigs, and crop remains. For example, the decorated Tapiancaing pottery on Taiwan gave. Figure 17.2, the paths of the Austronesian expansion, with approximate dates when each region was reached. For A equals Borneo, for B equals Celebes, for C equals Timor. 5A equals Halmahera. 5B equals Java, 5C equals Sumatra. 6A equals Bismarck Archipelago. 6B equals Malay Peninsula, 6C equals Vietnam. 7 equals Solomon Archipelago. 8 equals Santa Cruz, 9C equals Tonga, 9D equals New Caledonia. 10B equals Society Islands, 10C equals Cook Islands, 11A equals Tuamotu Archipelago. Way to undecorated plain or red pottery, which has also been found at sites in the Philippines and on the Indonesian islands of Celebes and Timor. This cultural package of pottery, stone tools, and domesticates appeared around 3000 BC in the Philippines, around 2500 BC on the Indonesian islands of Celebes and North Borneo and Timor, around 2000 BC on Java and Sumatra, and around 1600 BC in the New Guinea region. There, as we shall see, the expansion assumed a speedboat pace, as bearers of the cultural package raced eastward into the previously uninhabited Pacific Ocean beyond the Solomon Archipelago. The last phases of the expansion, during the millennium after AD 1, resulted in the colonization of every Polynesian and Micronesian island capable of supporting humans. Astonishingly, it also swept westward across the Indian Ocean to the east coast of Africa. Speedboat to Polynesia, resulting in the colonization of the island of Madagascar. At least until the expansion reached coastal New Guinea, travel between islands was probably by double outrigger sailing canoes, which are still widespread throughout Indonesia today. That boat design represented a major advantage over the simple dugout canoes prevalent among traditional peoples living on inland waterways throughout the world. A dugout canoe is just what its name implies, a solid tree trunk dugout, and its ends shaped by an adze. Since the canoe is as round-bottomed as the trunk from which it was created, the least imbalance in weight distribution tips the canoe toward the overweight side. Whenever I've been paddled in dugouts up New Guinea rivers by New Guineans, I have spent much of the trip in terror. It seemed that every slight movement of mine risked capsizing the canoe and spilling out me and my binoculars to commune with crocodiles. New Guineans manage to look secure while paddling dugouts on calm lakes and rivers, but not even New Guineans can use a dugout in seas with modest waves. Hence some stabilizing device must have been essential not only for the Austronesian expansion through Indonesia, but even for the initial colonization of Taiwan. The solution was to lash 2 smaller logs parallel to the hull and several feet from it, one on each side, connected to the hull by poles lashed perpendicular to the hull and outriggers. Whenever the hull starts to tip toward one side, the buoyancy of the outrigger on that side prevents the outrigger from being pushed under the water and hence makes it virtually impossible to capsize the vessel. The invention of the double outrigger sailing canoe may have been the technological breakthrough that triggered the Austronesian expansion from the Chinese mainland. 2 striking coincidences between archaeological and linguistic evidence support the inference that the people bringing a Neolithic culture to Taiwan, the Philippines, and Indonesia thousands of years ago spoke Austronesian languages and were ancestral to the Austronesian speakers, still inhabiting those islands today. First, both types of evidence point unequivocally to the colonization of Taiwan as the first stage of the expansion from the South China coast, and to the colonization of the Philippines and Indonesia from Taiwan as the next stage. If the expansion had proceeded from tropical Southeast Asia's Malay Peninsula to the nearest Indonesian island of Sumatra, then to other Indonesian islands, and finally to the Philippines and Taiwan, gauges of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, and the languages of Taiwan and the Philippines would have differentiated only recently within a single subfamily. Instead, the deepest divisions are in Taiwan, and the languages of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra fall together in the same subfamily, a recent branch of the Western Malayo-Polynesian subfamily, which is in turn a fairly recent branch of the Malayo-Polynesian subfamily. Those details of linguistic relationships agree perfectly with the archaeological evidence that the colonization of the Malay Peninsula was recent and followed rather than preceded the colonization of Taiwan, the Philippines, and Indonesia. The other coincidence between archaeological and linguistic evidence concerns the cultural baggage that ancient Austronesians used. Archaeology provides us with direct evidence of culture in the form of pottery, pig and fish bones, and so on. One might initially wonder how a linguist, studying only modern languages whose unwritten ancestral forms remain unknown, could ever figure out whether Austronesians living on Taiwan 6,000 years ago had pigs. The solution is to reconstruct the vocabularies of vanished ancient languages by comparing vocabularies of modern languages, derived from them. For instance, the words meaning sheep in many languages of the Indo-European language family, distributed from Ireland to India, are quite similar: avis, ovis, oveja, ovsa, ois, and voi, in Lithuanian, Sanskrit, Latin, Spanish, Russian, Greek, and Irish, respectively. Comparison of the sound shifts that the various modern Indo-European languages have undergone during their histories suggests that the original form was ois in the ancestral Indo-European language spoken around 6,000 years ago. That unwritten ancestral language is termed Proto-Indo-European. Evidently, Proto-Indo-Europeans 6,000 years ago had sheep, in agreement with archaeological evidence. Nearly 2,000 other words of their vocabulary can similarly be reconstructed, including words for goat, horse, wheel, brother, and eye. But no Proto-Indo-European word can be reconstructed for gun, which uses different roots in different modern Indo-European languages: gun in English, fusil in French, rusio in Russian, and so on. That shouldn't surprise us. People 6,000 years ago couldn't possibly have had a word for guns, which were invented only within the past 1,000 years. Since there was thus no inherited shared root meaning gun, each Indo-European language had to invent or borrow its own word when guns were finally invented. Proceeding in the same way, we can compare modern Taiwanese, Philippine, 296. Speedboat to Polynesia. Indonesian, and Polynesian languages to reconstruct a Proto-Austronesian language spoken in the distant past. To no one's surprise, that reconstructed Proto-Austronesian language had words with meanings such as two, bird, ear, and head louse. Of course, Proto-Austronesians could count to 2, knew of birds, and had ears and lice. More interestingly, the reconstructed language had words for pig, dog, and iris, which must therefore have been part of Proto-Austronesian culture. The reconstructed language is full of words indicating a maritime economy, such as outrigger canoe, sail, giant clam, octopus, fish trap, and sea turtle. This linguistic evidence regarding the culture of Proto-Austronesians, wherever and whenever they lived, agrees well with the archaeological evidence regarding the pottery-making, sea-oriented, food-producing people living on Taiwan around 6,000 years ago. The same procedure can be applied to reconstruct Proto-Malayo-Polynesian, the ancestral language spoken by Austronesians after emigrating from Taiwan. Proto-Malayo-Polynesian contains words for many tropical crops like taro, breadfruit, bananas, yams, and coconuts, for which no word can be reconstructed in Proto-Austronesian. Thus, the linguistic evidence suggests that many tropical crops were added to the Austronesian repertoire after the emigration from Taiwan. This conclusion agrees with archaeological evidence. As colonizing farmers spread southward from Taiwan toward the equatorial tropics, they came to depend increasingly on tropical root and tree crops, which they proceeded to carry with them out into the tropical Pacific. How could those Austronesian-speaking farmers from South China via Taiwan replace the original hunter-gatherer population of the Philippines and Western Indonesia so completely that little genetic and no linguistic evidence of that original population survived? The reasons resemble the reasons why Europeans replaced or exterminated native Australians within the last 2 centuries, and why South Chinese replaced the original tropical Southeast Asians earlier, the farmers' much denser populations, superior tools and weapons, more developed watercraft and maritime skills, and epidemic diseases to which the farmers, but not the hunter-gatherers, had some resistance. On the Asian mainland, Austronesian-speaking farmers were able similarly to replace some of the former hunter-gatherers of the Malay Peninsula. Because Austronesians colonized the peninsula from the south and east around the same time that Austroasiatic farmers were colonizing the peninsula from the north. Other Austronesians managed to establish themselves in parts of southern Vietnam and Cambodia to become the ancestors of the modern Chamic minority of those countries. However, Austronesian farmers could spread no farther into the Southeast Asian mainland, because Austroasiatic and Thai, Kadai farmers had already replaced the former hunter-gatherers there, and because Austronesian farmers had no advantage over Austroasiatic and Thai, Kadai farmers. Although we infer that Austronesian speakers originated from coastal South China, Austronesian languages today are not spoken anywhere in mainland China, possibly because they were among the hundreds of former Chinese languages eliminated by the southward expansion of Sino-Tibetan speakers. But the language families closest to Austronesian are thought to be Thai, Kadai, Austroasiatic, and Miao, Yao. Thus, while Austronesian languages in China may not have survived the onslaught of Chinese dynasties, some of their sister and cousin languages did. We have now followed the initial stages of the Austronesian expansion for 2,500 miles from the South China coast, through Taiwan and the Philippines, to western and central Indonesia. In the course of that expansion, Austronesians came to occupy all habitable areas of those islands, from the seacoast to the interior, and from the lowlands to the mountains. By 1500 BC, their familiar archaeological hallmarks, including pig bones and plain red-slipped pottery, show that they had reached the eastern Indonesian island of Halmahera, less than 200 miles from the western end of the big mountainous island of New Guinea. Did they proceed to overrun that island, just as they had already overrun the big mountainous islands of Celebes, Borneo, Java, and Sumatra? They did not, as a glance at the faces of modern New Guineans makes obvious, and as detailed studies of New Guinean genes confirm. My friend Waiwer and all other New Guinea Highlanders differ obviously from Indonesians, Filipinos, and South Chinese in their dark skins, tightly coiled hair, and face shapes. Most lowlanders from New Guinea's interior and south coast resemble the Highlanders except that they tend to be taller. Geneticists have failed to find characteristic Austronesian gene markers in blood samples from New Guinea Highlanders. But peoples of New Guinea's north and east coasts, and of the Bismarck and Solomon archipelagos north and east of New Guinea, present a more complex picture. In appearance, they are variably intermediate between Highlanders like Waiwer and Indonesians like Ahmad, though on the average considerably closer to Waiwer. Speedboat to Polynesia. Genetically, The Bismarck and Solomon Islanders and North Coastal New Guineans are about 15% Austronesian, and 85% like New Guinea Highlanders. Hence Austronesians evidently reached the New Guinea region but failed completely to penetrate the island's interior, and were genetically diluted by New Guinea's previous residents on the north coast and islands. Modern languages tell essentially the same story but add detail. In Chapter 15 I explained that most New Guinea languages, termed Papuan languages, are unrelated to any language families elsewhere in the world. Without exception, every language spoken in the New Guinea Mountains, the whole of southwestern and south-central lowland New Guinea, including the coast, and the interior of northern New Guinea is a Papuan language. But Austronesian languages are spoken in a narrow strip immediately on the north and southeast coasts. Most languages of the Bismarck and Solomon Islands are Austronesian. Papuan languages are spoken only in isolated pockets on a few islands. Austronesian languages spoken in the Bismarcks and Solomons and North Coastal New Guinea are related, as a separate subfamily termed Oceanic, to the subfamily of languages spoken on Halmahera and the west end of New Guinea. That linguistic relationship confirms, as one would expect from a map, that Austronesian speakers of the New Guinea region arrived by way of Halmahera. Details of Austronesian and Papuan languages and their distributions in North New Guinea testify to long contact between the Austronesian invaders and the Papuan-speaking residents. Both the Austronesian and the Papuan languages of the region show massive influences of each other's vocabularies and grammars, making it difficult to decide whether certain languages are basically Austronesian languages influenced by Papuan ones, or the reverse. As one travels from village to village along the north coast or its fringing islands, one passes from a village with an Austronesian language to a village with a Papuan language and then to another Austronesian-speaking village, without any genetic discontinuity at the linguistic boundaries. All this suggests that descendants of Austronesian invaders and of original New Guineans have been trading, intermarrying, and acquiring each other's genes and languages for several thousand years on the North New Guinea coast and its islands. That long contact transferred Austronesian languages more efficiently than Austronesian genes, with the result that most Bismarck and Solomon Islanders now speak Austronesian languages, even though their appearance and most of their genes are still Papuan. But neither the genes nor the languages of the Austronesians penetrated New Guinea's interior. The outcome of their invasion of New Guinea was thus very different from the outcome of their invasion of Borneo, Celebes, and other big Indonesian islands, where their steamroller eliminated almost all traces of the previous inhabitants' genes and languages. To understand what happened in New Guinea, let us now turn to the evidence from archaeology. Around 1600 BC, almost simultaneously with their appearance on Halmahera, the familiar archaeological hallmarks of the Austronesian expansion, pigs, chickens, dogs, red-slipped pottery, and adzes of ground stone and of giant clamshells, appear in the New Guinea region. But two features distinguish the Austronesians' arrival there from their earlier arrival in the Philippines and Indonesia. The first feature consists of pottery designs, which are aesthetic features of no economic significance but which do let archaeologists immediately recognize an early Austronesian site. Whereas most early Austronesian pottery in the Philippines and Indonesia was undecorated, pottery in the New Guinea region was finely decorated with geometric designs arranged in horizontal bands. In other respects the pottery preserved the red slip and the vessel forms characteristic of earlier Austronesian pottery in Indonesia. Evidently, Austronesian settlers in the New Guinea region got the idea of tattooing their pots, perhaps inspired by geometric designs that they had already been using on their bark cloth and body tattoos. This style is termed Lapita pottery, after an archaeological site named Lapita, where it was described. The much more significant distinguishing feature of early Austronesian sites in the New Guinea region is their distribution. In contrast to those in the Philippines and Indonesia, where even the earliest known Austronesian sites are on big islands like Luzon and Borneo and Celebes, sites with Lapita pottery in the New Guinea region are virtually confined to small islets fringing remote larger islands. To date, Lapita pottery has been found at only one site on the north coast of New Guinea itself, and at a couple of sites in the Solomons. Most Lapita sites of the New Guinea region are in the Bismarcks, on islets off the coast of the larger Bismarck Islands, occasionally on the coasts of the larger islands themselves. Since the makers of lapida pottery were capable of sailing thousands of miles, their failure to transfer their villages a few miles to the large Bismarck Islands, or a few dozen miles to New Guinea, was certainly not due to inability to get there. The basis of lapida subsistence can be reconstructed from the garbage excavated by archaeologists at lapida sites. Speedboat to Polynesia. Bligh also ate the usual Austronesian root crops, such as taro and yams. Evidence of those crops is hard to obtain, because hard nut shells are much more likely than soft roots to persist for thousands of years in garbage heaps. Naturally, it is impossible to prove directly that the people who made lapida pots spoke an Austronesian language. However, two facts make this inference virtually certain. First, except for the decorations on the pots themselves and their associated cultural paraphernalia are similar to the cultural remains found at Indonesian and Philippine sites ancestral to modern Austronesian-speaking societies. Second, lapida pottery also appears on remote Pacific islands with no previous human inhabitants, with no evidence of a major second wave of settlement subsequent to that bringing lapida pots, and where the modern inhabitants speak an Austronesian language. Hence lapida pottery may be safely assumed to mark Austronesians' arrival in the New Guinea region. What were those Austronesian potmakers doing on islets adjacent to bigger islands? They were probably living in the same way as modern potmakers lived until recently on islets in the New Guinea region. In 1972, I visited such a village on Malay Islet, in the Siassi Island group, off the medium-sized island of Umboy, off the larger Bismarck Island of New Britain. When I stepped ashore on Malay in search of birds, knowing nothing about the people there, I was astonished by the sight that greeted me. Instead of the usual small village of low huts, surrounded by large gardens sufficient to feed the village, and with a few canoes drawn up on the beach, most of the area of Malay was occupied by two-story wooden houses side by side. Leaving no ground available for gardens, the New Guinea equivalent of downtown Manhattan. On the beach were rows of big canoes. It turned out that Malay Islanders, besides being fishermen, were also specialized potters, carvers, and traders, who lived by making beautifully decorated pots and wooden bowls, transporting them in their canoes to larger islands and exchanging their wares for pigs, dogs, vegetables, and other necessities. Even the timber for Malay canoes was obtained by trade from villagers on nearby Umboy Island, since Malay does not have trees big enough to be fashioned into canoes. In the days before European shipping, trade between islands in the New Guinea region was monopolized by such specialized groups of canoe-building potters, skilled in sailing without navigational instruments, and living on offshore islets or occasionally in mainland coastal villages. Sightings in which traders were drowned. I would guess that the lapida potters were the inter-island traders of the New Guinea region in the centuries after 1600 BC. The spread of Austronesian languages to the north coast of New Guinea itself, and over even the largest Bismarck and Solomon Islands, must have occurred mostly after lapida times, since lapida sites themselves were concentrated on Bismarck islets. Not until around AD 1 did pottery derived from the lapida style appear on the south side of New Guinea's southeast peninsula. When Europeans began exploring New Guinea in the late 19th century, all the remainder of New Guinea's south coast still supported populations only of Papuan language speakers. Even though Austronesian-speaking populations were established not only on the southeastern peninsula but also on the Aru and K Islands. Austronesians thus had thousands of years in which to colonize New Guinea's interior and its southern coast from nearby bases, but they never did so. Even their colonization of North New Guinea's coastal fringe was more linguistic than genetic. All northern coastal peoples remained predominantly New Guineans in their genes. At most, some of them merely adopted Austronesian languages, possibly in order to communicate with the long-distance traders who linked societies. Thus, the outcome of the Austronesian expansion in the New Guinea region was opposite to that in Indonesia and the Philippines. In the latter region, the indigenous population disappeared, presumably driven off, killed, infected, or assimilated by the invaders. In the former region, the indigenous population mostly kept the invaders out. The invaders were the same in both cases, and the indigenous populations may also have been genetically similar to each other, if the original Indonesian population supplanted by Austronesians really was related to New Guineans, as I suggested earlier. Why the opposite outcomes? The answer becomes obvious when one considers the differing cultural circumstances of Indonesia's and New Guinea's indigenous populations. Before Austronesians arrived, most of Indonesia was thinly occupied by hunter-gatherers lacking even polished stone tools. In contrast, food production had already been established for thousands of years in the New Guinea highlands, and probably in the New Guinea lowlands and in the Bismarcks and Solomons as well. The New Guinea highlands supported some of the densest populations of Stone Age people anywhere in the modern world. Austronesians enjoyed few advantages in competing with those established 302. Speedboat to Polynesia. New Guinean populations. Some of the crops on which Austronesians subsisted, such as taro, yams, and bananas, had probably already been independently domesticated in New Guinea before Austronesians arrived. The New Guineans readily integrated Austronesian chickens, dogs, and especially pigs into their food-producing economies. New Guineans already had polished stone tools. They were at least as resistant to tropical diseases as were Austronesians, because they carried the same 5 types of genetic protections against malaria as did Austronesians, and some or all of those genes evolved independently in New Guinea. New Guineans were already accomplished seafarers, although not as accomplished as the makers of lapida pottery. Tens of thousands of years before the arrival of Austronesians, New Guineans had colonized the Bismarck and Solomon archipelagos, and a trade in obsidian was thriving in the Bismarcks at least 18,000 years before the Austronesians arrived. New Guineans even seem to have expanded recently westward against the Austronesian tide, into eastern Indonesia, where languages spoken on the islands of North Halmahera and of Timor are typical Papuan languages, related to some languages of western New Guinea. In short, the variable outcomes of the Austronesian expansion strikingly illustrate the role of food production in human population movements. Austronesian food producers migrated into 2 regions occupied by resident peoples who were probably related to each other. The residents of Indonesia were still hunter-gatherers, while the residents of New Guinea were already food producers and had developed many of the concomitants of food production. As a result, while the Austronesian expansion swept away the original Indonesians, it failed to make much headway in the New Guinea region, just as it also failed to make headway against Austroasiatic and Thai, Kadai food producers in tropical Southeast Asia. We have now traced the Austronesian expansion through Indonesia and up to the shores of New Guinea and tropical Southeast Asia. In Chapter 19 we shall trace it across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, while in Chapter 15 we saw that ecological difficulties kept Austronesians from establishing themselves in northern and western Australia. The expansion's remaining thrust began when the Lapita potters sailed far eastward into the Pacific beyond the Solomons, into an island realm that no other humans had reached previously. Around 1200 BC Lapita potsherds, the familiar triumvirate of pigs and chickens and dogs, and the usual other archaeological hallmarks of Austronesians appeared on the Pacific archipelagos of Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, over 1,000 miles east of the Solomons. Early in the Christian era, most of those same hallmarks appeared on the islands of eastern Polynesia, including the Societies and Marquesas. Further long overwater canoe voyages brought settlers north to Hawaii, east to Pitcairn and Easter Islands, and southwest to New Zealand. The native inhabitants of most of those islands today are the Polynesians, who thus are the direct descendants of the Lapita potters. They speak Austronesian languages closely related to those of the New Guinea region, and their main crops are the Austronesian package that included taro, yams, bananas, coconuts, and breadfruit. With the occupation of the Chatham Islands off New Zealand around AD 1400, barely a century before European explorers entered the Pacific, the task of exploring the Pacific was finally completed by Asians. Their tradition of exploration, lasting tens of thousands of years, had begun when Waiwer's ancestors spread through Indonesia to New Guinea and Australia. It ended only when it had run out of targets and almost every habitable Pacific island had been occupied. To anyone interested in world history, human societies of East Asia and the Pacific are instructive, because they provide so many examples of how environment molds history. Depending on their geographic homeland, East Asian and Pacific peoples differed in their access to domesticable wild plant and animal species and in their connectedness to other peoples. Again and again, people with access to the prerequisites for food production, and with a location favoring diffusion of technology from elsewhere, replaced peoples lacking these advantages. Again and again, when a single wave of colonists spread out over diverse environments, their descendants developed in separate ways, depending on those environmental differences. For instance, we have seen that South China developed indigenous food production and technology, received writing and still more technology and political structures from North China, and went on to colonize tropical Southeast Asia and Taiwan, largely replacing the former inhabitants of those areas. Within Southeast Asia, among the descendants or relatives of those food-producing South Chinese colonists, the Yumbri in the mountain rainforests of northeastern Thailand and Laos reverted to living as hunter-gatherers. While the Yumbri's close relatives, the Vietnamese, remained food producers in the rich Red Delta and established a vast metal-based empire. Similarly, among Austronesian emigrant farmers from Taiwan and Indonesia, the Punan in the rainforests of Borneo were forced to speedboat to Polynesia. Turn back to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, while their relatives living on Java's rich volcanic soils remained food producers, founded a kingdom under the influence of India, adopted writing, and built the great Buddhist monument at Borobudur. The Austronesians who went on to colonize Polynesia became isolated from East Asian metallurgy and writing and hence remained without writing or metal. As we saw in Chapter 2, though, Polynesian political and social organization and economies underwent great diversification in different environments. Within a millennium, East Polynesian colonists had reverted to hunting-gathering on the Chathams while building a proto-state, with intensive food production on Hawaii. When Europeans at last arrived, their technological and other advantages enabled them to establish temporary colonial domination over most of tropical Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. However, indigenous germs and food producers prevented Europeans from settling most of this region in significant numbers. Within this area, only New Zealand, New Caledonia, and Hawaii, the largest and most remote islands, lying farthest from the equator and hence in the most nearly temperate climates, now support large European populations. Thus, unlike Australia and the Americas, East Asia and most Pacific islands remain occupied by East Asian and Pacific peoples. Chapter 18. Hemispheres colliding. The largest population replacement of the last 13,000 years has been the one resulting from the recent collision between Old World and New World societies. Its most dramatic and decisive moment, as we saw in Chapter 3, occurred when Pizarro's tiny army of Spaniards captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, absolute ruler of the largest, richest, most populous, and administratively and technologically most advanced Native American state. Atahualpa's capture symbolizes the European conquest of the Americas, because the same mix of proximate factors that caused it was also responsible for European conquests of other Native American societies. Let us now return to that collision of hemispheres, applying what we have learned since Chapter 3. The basic question to be answered is, why did Europeans reach and conquer the lands of Native Americans, instead of vice versa? Our starting point will be a comparison of Eurasian and Native American societies as of AD 1492, the year of Columbus's discovery of the Americas. Our comparison begins with food production, a major determinant of local population size and societal complexity, hence an ultimate factor behind the conquest. The most glaring difference between American and Eurasian food production involved big domestic mammal species. In Chapter 9 we encountered Eurasia's 13 species, which became its chief source of animal protein, wool, and hides, its main mode of land transport of people and goods, its indispensable vehicles of warfare, and a big enhancer of crop production. Until water wheels and windmills began to replace Eurasia's mammals in medieval times, they were also the major source of its industrial power beyond human muscle power, for example, for turning grindstones and operating water lifts. In contrast, the Americas had only one species of big domestic mammal, the llama alpaca, confined to a small area of the Andes and the adjacent Peruvian coast. While it was used for meat, wool, hides, and goods. Hemispheres colliding. Transport, it never yielded milk for human consumption, never bore a rider, never pulled a cart or a plow, and never served as a power source or vehicle of warfare. That's an enormous set of differences between Eurasian and Native American societies, due largely to the late Pleistocene extinction of most of North and South America's former big wild mammal species. If it had not been for those extinctions, modern history might have taken a different course. When Cortés and his bedraggled adventurers landed on the Mexican coast in 1519, they might have been driven into the sea by thousands of Aztec cavalry mounted on domesticated Native American horses. Instead of the Aztecs dying of smallpox, the Spaniards might have been wiped out by American germs transmitted by disease-resistant Aztecs. American civilizations resting on animal power might have been sending their own conquistadores to ravage Europe. But those hypothetical outcomes were foreclosed by mammal extinctions thousands of years earlier. Those extinctions left Eurasia with many more wild candidates for domestication than the Americas offered. Most candidates disqualify themselves as potential domesticates for any of half a dozen reasons. Hence Eurasia ended up with its 13 species of big domestic mammals and the Americas with just its one very local species. Both hemispheres also had domesticated species of birds and small mammals, the turkey, guinea pig, and Muscovy duck very locally and the dog more widely in the Americas, chickens, geese, ducks, cats, dogs, rabbits, honeybees, silkworms, and some others in Eurasia. But the significance of all those species of small domestic animals was trivial compared with that of the big ones. Eurasia and the Americas also differed with respect to plant food production, though the disparity here was less marked than for animal food production. In 1492 agriculture was widespread in Eurasia. Among the few Eurasian hunter-gatherers lacking both crops and domestic animals were the Ainu of northern Japan, Siberian societies without reindeer, and small hunter-gatherer groups scattered through the forests of India and tropical Southeast Asia and trading with neighboring farmers. Some other Eurasian societies, notably the Central Asian pastoralists and the reindeer-herding Lapps and Samoyeds of the Arctic, had domestic animals but little or no agriculture. Virtually all other Eurasian societies engaged in agriculture as well as in herding animals. Agriculture was also widespread in the Americas, but hunter-gatherers occupied a larger fraction of the Americas area than of Eurasia's. Culture. It is striking that the areas of Native America without food production included what today, after Europeans' arrival, are some of the most productive farmlands and pastures of both North and South America, the Pacific states of the United States, Canada's wheat belt, the Pampas of Argentina, and the Mediterranean zone of Chile. The former absence of food production in these lands was due entirely to their local paucity of domesticable wild animals and plants, and to geographic and ecological barriers that prevented the crops and the few domestic animal species of other parts of the Americas from arriving. Those lands became productive not only for European settlers but also, in some cases, for Native Americans, as soon as Europeans introduced suitable domestic animals and crops. For instance, Native American societies became renowned for their mastery of horses, and in some cases of cattle and sheep herding, in parts of the Great Plains, the western United States, and the Argentine Pampas. Those mounted plains warriors and Navajo sheepherders and weavers now figure prominently in white Americans' image of American Indians, but the basis for that image was created only after 1492. These examples demonstrate that the sole missing ingredients required to sustain food production in large areas of the Americas were domestic animals and crops themselves. In those parts of the Americas that did support Native American agriculture, it was constrained by 5 major disadvantages vis-a-vis Eurasian agriculture: widespread dependence on protein-poor corn, instead of Eurasia's diverse and protein-rich cereals, hand-planting of individual seeds, instead of broadcast sowing, tilling by hand instead of plowing by animals, which enables one person to cultivate a much larger area, and which also permits cultivation of some fertile but tough soils and sods that are difficult to till by hand. Lack of animal manuring to increase soil fertility, and just human muscle power, instead of animal power, for agricultural tasks such as threshing, grinding, and irrigation. These differences suggest that Eurasian agriculture as of 1492 may have yielded on the average more calories and protein per person-hour of labor than Native American agriculture did. Such differences in food production constituted a major ultimate cause of the disparities between Eurasian and Native American societies. Among the resulting proximate factors behind the conquest, the most important included differences in germs, technology, political organization, and writing. Of these, the one linked most directly to the differences in food production was germs. The infectious diseases that regularly visited crowded Eurasian societies, and to which many hemispheres colliding. Eurasians consequently developed immune or genetic resistance, included all of history's most lethal killers, smallpox, measles, influenza, plague, tuberculosis, typhus, cholera, malaria, and others. Against that grim list, the sole crowd infectious diseases that can be attributed with certainty to pre-Columbian Native American societies were non-syphilitic treponemas. This continental difference in harmful germs resulted paradoxically from the difference in useful livestock. Most of the microbes responsible for the infectious diseases of crowded human societies evolved from very similar ancestral microbes causing infectious diseases of the domestic animals with which food producers began coming into daily close contact around 10,000 years ago. Eurasia harbored many domestic animal species and hence developed many such microbes, while the Americas had very few of each. Other reasons why Native American societies evolved so few lethal microbes were that villages, which provide ideal breeding grounds for epidemic diseases, arose thousands of years later in the Americas than in Eurasia, and that the three regions of the New World supporting urban societies were never connected by fast, high-volume trade on the scale that brought plague, influenza, and possibly smallpox to Europe from Asia. As a result, even malaria and yellow fever, the infectious diseases that eventually became major obstacles to European colonization of the Americas tropics, and that posed the biggest barrier to the construction of the Panama Canal, are not American diseases at all but are caused by microbes of Old World tropical origin, introduced to the Americas by Europeans. Rivaling germs as proximate factors behind Europe's conquest of the Americas were the differences in all aspects of technology. These differences stemmed ultimately from Eurasia's much longer history of densely populated, economically specialized, politically centralized, interacting and competing societies dependent on food production. 5 areas of technology may be singled out. First, metals, initially copper, then bronze, and finally iron, were used for tools in all complex Eurasian societies as of 1492. In contrast, although copper, silver, gold, and alloys were used for ornaments in the Andes and some other parts of the Americas, stone and wood and bone were still the principal materials for tools in all Native American societies, which made only limited local use of copper tools. Second, military technology was far more potent in Eurasia than in the AMR 309. ICAs. European weapons were steel swords, lances, and daggers, supplemented by small firearms and artillery, while body armor and helmets were also made of solid steel or else of chain mail. In place of steel, Native Americans used clubs and axes of stone or wood, slings, bows and arrows, and quilted armor, constituting much less effective protection and weaponry. In addition, Native American armies had no animals to oppose to horses, whose value for assaults and fast transport gave Europeans an overwhelming advantage until some Native American societies themselves adopted them. Third, Eurasian societies enjoyed a huge advantage in their sources of power to operate machines. The earliest advance over human muscle power was the use of animals, cattle, horses, and donkeys, to pull plows and to turn wheels for grinding grain, raising water, and irrigating or draining fields. Water wheels appeared in Roman times and then proliferated, along with tidal mills and windmills, in the Middle Ages. Coupled to systems of geared wheels, those engines harnessing water and wind power were used not only to grind and move water, but also to serve myriad manufacturing purposes, including crushing sugar, driving blast furnace bellows, grinding ores, making paper, polishing stone, pressing oil, producing salt, producing textiles, and sawing wood. It is conventional to define the Industrial Revolution arbitrarily as beginning with the harnessing of steam power in 18th century England, but in fact an industrial revolution based on water and wind power had begun already in medieval times in many parts of Europe. As of 1492, all of those operations to which animal, water, and wind power were being applied in Eurasia were still being carried out by human muscle power in the Americas. Long before the wheel began to be used in power conversion in Eurasia, it had become the basis of most Eurasian land transport, not only for animal-drawn vehicles but also for human-powered wheelbarrows, which enabled one or more people, still using just human muscle power, to transport much greater weights than they could have otherwise. Wheels were also adopted in Eurasian pottery making and in clocks. None of those uses of the wheel was adopted in the Americas, where wheels are attested only in Mexican ceramic toys. The remaining area of technology to be mentioned is sea transport. Many Eurasian societies developed large sailing ships, some of them capable of sailing against the wind and crossing the ocean, equipped with sextants, magnetic compasses, stern-post rudders, and cannons. In capacity, speed, maneuverability, and seaworthiness, those Eurasian ships were far superior to the rafts that carried out trade between the New World's most advanced societies, those of the Andes and hemispheres colliding. Mesoamerica. Those rafts sailed with the wind along the Pacific coast. Pizarro's ship easily ran down and captured such a raft on his first voyage toward Peru. In addition to their germs and technology, Eurasian and Native American societies differed in their political organization. By late medieval or Renaissance times, most of Eurasia had come under the rule of organized states. Among these, the Habsburg, Ottoman, and Chinese states, the Mughal state of India, and the Mongol state at its peak in the 13th century started out as large polyglot amalgamations, formed by the conquest of other states. For that reason they are generally referred to as empires. Many Eurasian states and empires had official religions that contributed to state cohesion, being invoked to legitimize the political leadership and to sanction wars against other peoples. Tribal and band societies in Eurasia were largely confined to the Arctic reindeer herders, the Siberian hunter-gatherers, and the hunter-gatherer enclaves in the Indian subcontinent and tropical Southeast Asia. The Americas had two empires, those of the Aztecs and Incas, which resembled their Eurasian counterparts in size, population, polyglot makeup, official religions, and origins in the conquest of smaller states. In the Americas, those were the sole two political units capable of mobilizing resources for public works, or war on the scale of many Eurasian states, whereas 7 European states had the resources to acquire American colonies between 1492 and 1666. The Americas also held many chiefdoms in tropical South America, Mesoamerica beyond Aztec rule, and the U.S. Southeast. The rest of the Americas was organized only at the tribal or band level. The last proximate factor to be discussed is writing. Most Eurasian states had literate bureaucracies, and in some a significant fraction of the populace other than bureaucrats was also literate. Writing empowered European societies by facilitating political administration and economic exchanges, motivating and guiding exploration and conquest, and making available a range of information and human experience extending into remote places and times. In contrast, use of writing in the Americas was confined to the elite in a small area of Mesoamerica. The Inca Empire employed an accounting system and mnemonic device based on knots, but it could not have approached writing as a vehicle for transmitting detailed information. Thus, Eurasian societies in the time of Columbus enjoyed big advantages over Native American societies in food production, germs, technology, including weapons, political organization, and writing. These were the main factors tipping the outcome of the post-Columbian collisions. But those differences as of AD 1492 represent just one snapshot of historical trajectories that had extended over at least 13,000 years in the Americas, and over a much longer time in Eurasia. For the Americas, in particular, the 1492 snapshot captures the end of the independent trajectory of Native Americans. Let us now trace out the earlier stages of those trajectories. Table 18.1 summarizes approximate dates of the appearance of key developments in the main homelands of each hemisphere. It also includes the trajectory for the minor New World homeland of the eastern United States, and that for England, which is not a homeland at all but is listed to illustrate how rapidly development spread from the Fertile Crescent. This table is sure to horrify any knowledgeable scholar, because it reduces exceedingly complex histories to a few seemingly precise dates. In reality, all of these. This table gives approximate dates of widespread adoption of significant developments in 3 Eurasian and 4 Native American areas. Dates for animal domestication neglect dogs, which were domesticated earlier than food-producing animals in both Eurasia and the Americas. Hemispheres colliding. Dates are merely attempts to label arbitrary points along a continuum. For example, more significant than the date of the first metal tool found by some archaeologists is the time when a significant fraction of all tools was made of metal. But how common must metal tools be to rate as a widespread? Dates for the appearance of the same development may differ among different parts of the same homeland. For instance, within the Andean region, pottery appears about 1,300 years earlier in coastal Ecuador than in Peru. Some dates, such as those for the rise of chiefdoms, are more difficult to infer from the archaeological record than are dates of artifacts like pottery or metal tools. Some of the dates in Table 18.1 are very uncertain, especially those for the onset of American food production. Nevertheless, as long as one understands that the table is a simplification, it is useful for comparing continental histories. The table suggests that food production began to provide a large fraction of human diets around 5,000 years earlier in the Eurasian homelands than in those of the Americas. A caveat must be mentioned immediately. While there is no doubt about the antiquity of food production in Eurasia, there is controversy about its historical trajectories of Eurasia and the Americas. Native America. Chiefdoms are inferred from archaeological evidence, such as ranked burials, architecture, and settlement patterns. The table greatly simplifies a complex mass of historical facts. See the text for some of the many important caveats. Onset in the Americas. In particular, archaeologists often cite considerably older claimed dates for domesticated plants at Coxcotlan Cave in Mexico, at Guitarrero Cave in Peru, and at some other American sites than the dates given in the table. Those claims are now being re-evaluated for several reasons. Recent direct radiocarbon dating of crop remains themselves has in some cases been yielding younger dates. The older dates previously reported were based instead on charcoal thought to be contemporaneous with the plant remains, but possibly not so. And the status of some of the older plant remains as crops or just as collected wild plants is uncertain. Still, even if plant domestication did begin earlier in the Americas than the dates shown in Table 18.1, agriculture surely did not provide the basis for most human calorie intake and sedentary existence in American homelands, until much later than in Eurasian homelands. As we saw in chapters 5 and 10, only a few relatively small areas of each hemisphere acted as a homeland, where food production first arose and from which it then spread. Those homelands were the Fertile Crescent and China in Eurasia, and the Andes and Amazonia, Mesoamerica, and the eastern United States in the Americas. The rate of spread of key developments is especially well understood for Europe, thanks to the many archaeologists at work there. As Table 18. 1 summarizes for England, once food production and village living had arrived from the Fertile Crescent after a long lag, the subsequent lag for England's adoption of chiefdoms, states, writing, and especially metal tools was much shorter, 2,000 years for the first widespread metal tools of copper and bronze, and only 250 years for widespread iron tools. Evidently, it was much easier for one society of already sedentary farmers to borrow metallurgy from another such society than for nomadic hunter-gatherers to borrow food production from sedentary farmers. Why were the trajectories of all key developments shifted to later dates in the Americas than in Eurasia? For groups of reasons suggest themselves, the later start, more limited suite of wild animals and plants available for domestication, greater barriers to diffusion, and possibly smaller or more isolated areas of dense human populations in the Americas than in Eurasia. As for Eurasia's head start, humans have occupied Eurasia for about 1 million years, far longer than they have lived in the Americas. Hemispheres colliding. ICA by 10,000 BC. Even if the disputed claims of older human occupation sites in the Americas prove valid, Those postulated pre-Clovis inhabitants remained for unknown reasons very sparsely distributed, and did not launch a Pleistocene proliferation of hunter-gatherer societies with expanding populations, technology, and art as in the Old World. Food production was already arising in the Fertile Crescent only 1,500 years after the time when Clovis-derived hunter-gatherers were just reaching southern South America. Several possible consequences of that Eurasian head start deserve consideration. First, could it have taken a long time after 11,000 BC for the Americas to fill up with people? When one works out the likely numbers involved, one finds that this effect would make only a trivial contribution to the Americas' 5,000-year lag in food-producing villages. The calculations given in Chapter 1 tell us that even if a mere 100 pioneering Native Americans had crossed the Canadian border into the lower United States and increased at a rate of only 1% per year, they would have saturated the Americas with hunter-gatherers within 1,000 years. Spreading south at a mere 1 mile per month,